I'm grateful to everyone who's been saying hello in the chat box and being really honest about how they're feeling this morning. You know, in this mental health world, we know that if you can name it, you can tame it, right? And that honesty and recognition of our own emotions is foundational to everything we do. So no worries using 2 words, Elizabeth. I love it. Mildly anxious. I have to tell you, I'm feeling hopeful that I can help to bring value to this next hour as we gather together. Webinar's not the format I usually use, so if I'm a little clunky in my technology, please stick with me and forgive me, but we'll make do as we go. I think you should see my video right now. I wanted to say hello as close to in person as I could, but I'm actually going to be turning it off just to save our bandwidth. So hello with my face, and now you are stuck with just my voice. But we will go ahead and get started with the topic of the day. We are here today to, what a title, right? Talk about anxiety, depression, but also resilience and motivation. We want to make sure we cover the full cycle of mental health when things are going well and when things are challenging. So we're going to be providing really an overview of these topics. I'll mention now that we'll also be joining together for 2 more sessions in this series. So today will be somewhat of a framing. We will just barely touch base on things, and we will go deeper in the next 2 sessions. They will be held also Thursdays at 11, 2 weeks from now, and then 2 weeks after that. So I hope you'll join us again. I just want to introduce myself really quickly. This seems like a bit of a brag list, but really the point of this is to just let you know where I'm coming from, what my qualifications are, and what they are not. So I am an educator, long-term educator. I tend to gravitate toward really our most vulnerable populations and students, and that has led me down a mental health path. At the same time, I want to make clear I am not a psychologist, I am not a psychiatrist, I am not a mental health provider, I am not a counselor. I just want to be clear what my qualifications are. I'm coming to you humbly with the purview of an educator. I've helped to co-found an alternative secondary learning center, an alternative high school, if you will, and most of our kiddos come to us not because they've gotten in trouble or are causing trouble in their home schools, but mostly because they're dealing with mental health concerns. We see a ton of anxiety, depression, and other concerns. So that's the practical experience I bring. And then there are some professional titles there as well. Always focused on mental health and learning supports. And I volunteer in mental health when there are emergencies in my area. And perhaps my greatest qualification, I'm trying my best to raise these 4 human beings as a mom. So they're complicated, and we can probably all relate. It's messy, but I get some mental health practice there for sure. My commitment to you today is to, as your facilitator, provide the learning environment and respect our time. If you have questions, follow up on them, try to be as informative as I can, but really just facilitating a conversation between us all. My request from you is that you be present as much as possible. We know multitasking is a reality and our days are layered up, but be here as much as you can. Bring your knowledge in the chat box or with your voice. You are welcome to unmute at any time. I believe you have the capacity to do so. If for some reason that's not working for you, please use that chat box, and don't be afraid to holler at me if I miss something important. I'll try to monitor it at the same time that we move along. And as always, we're respecting the views of others as we go. Really, the goals of this series are to overview mental health considerations in our classrooms, clarify the role of instructor, what we can and can't do, and explore practices to promote coping skills and resilience. So that's our mission, our joint mission. Okay, so let's start with this image, just because it spoke to me as I was doing some research and pulling this together. I don't know, maybe put in the chat box or raise your hand if you can relate to this image. We all know that there are layers of issues going on for all of us. Some of us may be more serious than others. Some of us have it easier than others. It's all relative, right? We're all experiencing things and stressors and layers of things. So life is throwing us lemons, we keep making lemonade, right? But I really enjoy this image, reminding me that so many of our students are feeling the same way. Our colleagues are feeling the same way, our families, and definitely us. So let's just acknowledge that from the start, that we have a lot of layers going on. The National Alliance on Mental Health released some statistics about the prevalence of what we're calling mental health concerns or mental illnesses. Oh, me too, Elizabeth. She says she's concerned for the students who don't know how to make lemonade. So hopefully we'll get into that in these next few sessions. We plan to. But let's just look at prevalence of those who are struggling. 1 in 5 adults each year, 1 in 20 adults experiencing serious mental illness, 1 in 6 youth, and 50% of lifetime mental illness really manifesting by age 14, 75% by age 24. And then we know as adults, we can encounter issues as well. So we're not trying to paint a bleak picture here, but we're just briefly acknowledging the fact that in each of our meeting rooms and each of our classrooms, statistically, we know that there will be people who are struggling. And then we throw on a global pandemic, right? And I won't spend too much time on this. We all know these things to be true, but the numbers are interesting. I've dug into lots of studies, but just this one meta-analysis, I was impressed with their methods of their study, and they calculated that in 2020, we had an additional 53 million cases of a major depressive disorder. That's worldwide, but we know that reporting varies from country to country and region to region, so we know these numbers aren't perfect. But also 76 million more cases of anxiety disorder. So that's 25%, 26% increases. We know that this pandemic has wreaked havoc on many of us. And so hence ICSPS and many other organizations prioritizing conversations around mental health. So again, that's why we're here. We also know that when we're talking about pandemic, women bore the brunt of many of the stressors related to juggling roles of caregivers, students, professionals. So we weren't surprised that this study also showed a discrepancy with women more likely to experience these disorders as a result of the pandemic. So that's just a few of the statistics that we could dig into. I don't want today to be statistic heavy. I want us to get into some good conversation about what the realities are looking like in your classrooms. So we will move on and just start to kind of dissect some of these words that we're throwing around, like disorders and really stress. Let's start with stress. I will preview this section of our presentation to let you know that we are just scratching the surface. These are kind of layman's terms, defining these things. For those of us on the line with much more clinical experience, the vagueness of some of these terms might be a little crazy making, but we're going to stay at this level and a bit vague and not dive too deep into definitions today. We will go deeper later on in our series. But stress, we're talking about how we react to external conditions or situations. We're feeling stressed about a presentation, stressed about having too much to do, stressed about how our relationship is playing out with someone else. This can be short-term, long-term. We are attuned to chronic stress and its impacts on us, both physically and mentally. When we're looking for symptoms, we can be irritable, fatigued, we can feel pain in our muscles, we can have lots of digestive troubles, tummy troubles are always a good sign that something's going on, difficulty sleeping, and you'll see that these symptoms are synonymous with many of the symptoms of other things we'll be taking a look at. One question we get a lot is, what's the difference between stress and, say, trauma? These things are overlapping concepts that impact each other, but when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about an event or series of events or circumstances that we experience as being harmful, and how much of that is based in fact or perception sometimes matters, but sometimes to be honest, doesn't matter as much, but we're perceiving it to be harmful and it's overwhelming our normal coping mechanisms to the point where we are neurologically hijacked by this trauma, and it keeps us in an elevated state that really has adverse effects on our lives, on our functioning and our well-being. So that's how we categorize when we're moving from talking about stress or chronic stress to trauma, really this kind of neurological overwhelm that keeps us in one of these states. We're either in a fight mode where we're the parts of our brain that get us heightened to defend ourselves are elevated and stay that way, a flight mode where we're trying to avoid the issue. And this doesn't always look like running away. This can look like a learner at their desk with their head down who's kind of checked out. That could be fatigue, that could be disengagement, that could be trauma. It could be lots of things. A freeze response as well, just appearing numb or unresponsive, that same idea of spacing out. And even this fawn response in response to trauma, people trying super hard to please and to avoid conflict because they've experienced trauma in their lives. So that's what we're talking about, staying in an elevated or heightened neurological state when trauma kind of hijacks the thinking part of our brain, and we stay more in that primal part of our brain. Another term that we're talking about in depth today, and really if we had a primary focus, anxiety. We know that anxiety is showing up in our classrooms in a multitude of ways. And if trauma is an impact of our brain because of what's happened to us in the past, let's think of anxiety as a preoccupation or even an obsession about what could happen to us in the future. We're worrying. We are obsessing over things we can't control. That could include illness or accidents or death. Symptoms can look very similar: difficulty concentrating, fatigue, muscle tension, sleeping issues, irritability, stomach issues. So a lot of these things are overlapping, but that would be a difference between trauma and anxiety. Anxiety is preoccupation or worry about what could happen. Could that be a result of trauma and stem from trauma? Absolutely. But those are the kind of the basic distinctions that we'll draw today. We also want to touch on the idea of depression. We would need lots of sessions to go into any of these concepts in depth, but for our purposes today, let's talk about depression as an ongoing low feeling, a sad feeling, a feeling of loss, a feeling of disinterest, even in things that we used to get hyped up about or enjoy. We just can't quite muster that enthusiasm anymore. Symptoms can include many of the same things: appetite issues, stomach issues, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and branch into areas of suicidal ideation or thoughts of death in that way. So I realize that I'm being very vague about when things are clinically diagnosable and when maybe people are just interpreting their own experiences as I'm feeling depressed. I'm going to be honest, in a sense, I'm being vague in on purpose. Because for many intents and purposes, absolutely it matters. How long have we seen something? Is it diagnosable as a disorder? Is this something going on neurologically? For our purposes as an instructor, even if someone's just perceiving, oh, I'm really having all these struggles, I'm feeling depressed, we don't have to get hung up on diagnoses at that point to be helpful. So we want to make sure we're primed to be helpful no matter how these things are presenting, whether they're officially diagnosed or not. If people are labeling what they're experiencing in these ways, those are flags to us as well. These things are not mutually exclusive, as we said. Sometimes they're even causal. One thing happens and leads to another. Their symptoms overlap. You can be dealing with multiple things at once. You can be dealing with things at different levels of extremity. So let's kind of keep this kind of braided but loose approach today as we talk about how to be helpful in our roles. The other thing we want to keep in mind, of course, is that mental health challenges, even if they're spoken about in loose terms, are not a choice. They're things we're experiencing and they're directly a result of neuroscience. So here we have, a screenshot of scans of two different brains, one experiencing trauma, that's on the right, one not, that's on your left. Just an image, a big image here to remind us that we're talking about brain activity. We're talking about brain chemistry. Sometimes we're talking about the physical makeup of the brain and the different parts of the brain, if they're enlarged, if they're deactive, if they're behaving in a different way. So we want to put that awareness on today, that we're really talking about the brain as we go on today. And this is why inevitably when I give these presentations, these are the type of things I see in the chat box, people talking about their learners kind of shutting down and not being able to focus and just sitting. And of course, we know that can be many things. As we said, that could be disengagement because they're not digging what's going on today. It could be, I didn't get sleep last night. It can also be levels of distress that could be linked to mental health issues. The more aware we are, the more we can respond. And I'll just pause there and ask, how are mental health challenges showing up in your classrooms right now? I've been speaking for way too long, so feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to use the chat box. I'd love to just spend some time hearing from you. What brought you here today, or how are these things showing up in your context?
And so Shanna, unfortunately in webinar, they don't have the ability to unmute, but they can raise their hand. And if you have a working microphone, I can unmute you, or you can put it in the chat as well, whichever you would prefer.
Great, thank you, Brittany. So raising our hand function or the chat function, if anyone would like to share. Looks like Elizabeth.
So Elizabeth, let me give you the ability to unmute.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I was just going to say, kind of like I put in there, I just worry as I see folks out there and wonder what's going on. I'm actually an administrator, so I'm a couple levels away. I'm not teaching anymore, but I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that kind of has got me thinking about all this is having recently been at an adult ed conference in Seattle. And there's homeless folks in any community, I recognize that. But the biggest difference I noted there was how many were young. And I thought, wow, this just really, it makes me just, I feel, what is there I could do, or, you know what I mean? Just all of the emotions that you go through. So I didn't have, like I said, I haven't taught for several years, but just seeing all these young homeless people makes me wonder how many of them may be or may have had any of these experiences or several of the experiences that you've detailed thus far, and how it's impacting them. And that certainly many of them could very well be of either high school or college age, and yet they're on the streets. So
absolutely. So I join you in the pain of that observation, and what you're mourning there with what you just said is, you can envision a different trajectory, a different path for these young people. And your hunch that mental health issues could be or are likely involved is, of course, a smart hunch. And we have the research that shows super compelling connection between homelessness and mental health concerns. So I just join you in, the troublesome nature of that observation, and I'm grateful to you and everyone being here to learn what we can do more. You had said before, let's help them know how to make the lemonade, and that's exactly where we want to go with these 3 series. What are some practical things that we can do and model that can be helpful while we're also caring for ourselves? So thank you for that, Elizabeth. Denise shares several students are anxious, they're stressed out due to long work hours. I'm assuming that means their academic studies, that means working to make a living, that means working to care for family members. We are so layered up right now. And your comment reminds me to mention that we're going to talk about coping mechanisms and strategies and how to do better. But another important part of the conversation has to be, how can people not be expected to do too much? That at the end of the day, when our to-do lists are not in accordance with the available time and resources, that's a perfect storm for stress and anxiousness and feeling low. So we want to acknowledge that too, that plates are really too full in many instances. So when we're talking about strategies to cope better, we don't want to be insensitive to that fact as well. And of course, lots are just tired. As you said, they're dealing with all those practical demands and they're tired, and we are getting smarter and smarter about the necessity of sleep and how directly correlated our sleep, quality of sleep and quantity of sleep is connected to our mental health. So we'll be talking about sleep these few days as well. Anybody else want to jump in at this point before we move on as far as what you're observing in your roles? Okay, well, I think our comments were pretty indicative probably of what the group is seeing. So we'll move along. Of course, speaking of our roles, our concern as educators, as educational administrators, as student support personnel is the learning process, right? That's the business we're in. So when folks are having difficulty processing information and language, difficulty regulating their emotions in a way that they can attune to learning, difficulty forming relationships with us as their professors or their peers, we know that that's a problem. The tragedy of this last bit about relationships is that we also know that relationships are the most potent protective factor as far as alleviating the impact of mental health concerns. So we want to talk about human resilience, all those capacities within us that help us to overcome mental health challenges and practical challenges in our lives. And relationships are so key to that. So when we're talking about this positive adaptive response and protective factors, just to generalize them, we're talking about supportive relationships. We're talking about feeling in control over your circumstances, really feeling that more things are within your sphere of control than not, or coming to peace with those things that are not. The cultural and faith traditions help us along, as do our environments, including schools. So now we're bridging into why we're here and what our roles can be in schools. Let's see, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about, forgive my PowerPoint having a mind of its own. Let's talk a little bit about what I like to call the lake, the stream, and the waterfall. So we all know the stories, right, of someone walking along and being aghast because someone's falling over the waterfall, and they become very busy trying to save the people who are falling over the waterfall, that they don't have time or energy to go upstream and notice when it becomes turbulent, and even go further upstream and support people when the lake is calm, maybe hand them a paddle and a boat, right? So that's kind of indicative of where we are in so many institutions right now, including post-secondary education institutions. And we have professionals on board that are dealing, hopefully, with those going over the waterfall, but they are completely overwhelmed by the caseload. And we ask ourselves, what can some of us do who are still up in the lake area to help people who, before things become elevated to the point where they need more intensive help? And it helps, I think, to look at the services within our institutions, within our colleges, in a tiered sense. So maybe this is a familiar way that you look at things, maybe it's not, but we can look at it as, what can we do proactively for all learners and all our colleagues as a system to help people stay healthy? What can we do when we notice that people are struggling and different groups need a little extra assistance or attention or intervention? And what can we do when needs become really intense, and where can they go? So many of you have probably seen a pyramid of this nature, outlining universal, targeted, or more intensive supports. I think it's most helpful to flip that pyramid on its side and look at it as layers, because we're really not talking about people making up these different phases of this pyramid. We're talking about people moving in between these layers of supports. So the layers represent the supports that are available in our classrooms or in our institutions, and we label them as far as the intensity of the need. But we, for our intents and purposes today, are on that universal level of what can we do as instructors that are helpful, because we are not psychologists, we are not psychiatrists, we are not mental health professionals, although we can certainly link to them in helpful ways. So let's frame the whole rest of our conversation around supports in this kind of tiered way, and let's place ourselves in this universal tier. What can we do for all learners? And as we're kind of diving into our roles, I like to think of it as alchemy. You know, there's no strict formula for what we can do to be helpful, but there's this kind of science and art of alchemy that really can be powerful. Alchemy, if you remember, is a chemical reaction that kind of makes a transformation or produces something new. This is the age-old science where we try to take metal and turn it into gold, right? So this process and our role, let's just remind ourselves, can be influential, can be transformational in people's lives. I don't have to tell you the importance that you play for your learners. I'm sure you have many wonderful stories affirming that, or I hope you do. But keeping with this kind of chemistry analogy or science analogy, sometimes we play the role of conductor, and that's where we're talking about that red tier, that yellow tier. We're talking about more intensive needs. So when the needs are more intensive, we as a conductor can be receptive, can be aware, can be knowledgeable about the resources that are available, can be very open and transparent as we share those resources. Maybe you are announcing them in class, maybe they're on the wall, they can be right at the top of your syllabus. If you're needing help in these ways, here are resources that are available to you. And if we are made aware of those higher needs concerns, those more intensive concerns, we can be a conduit of care. We can be a conduit by carrying ourselves as if we care at all times, so that people feel open to come to us. And then we can connect people with the resources they need. But again, we can't connect if we don't know that they're there, right? So conductor, the energy is moving through us if we're thinking of this scientifically. And in a caring, open way, we are helping to connect people. So let's jump back to that universal tier. In the universal tier, and this is where we'll focus the rest of our time, we can be more of a catalyst. I don't want to overstate our responsibilities, because we are not, again, mental health professionals, we're instructors, but we also know that mental health is a key component of our classrooms, that if we don't address or try to be helpful mental health needs, that will create more trouble, more work, more suffering, if you will, for everyone down the line. So there are smart ways that we can adapt our way of being, our way of doing, to be helpful, that should not mean more layers of work. And I really want to stress this. Everyone has enough layers of work. A lot of this is about mindset and language and modeling and just the way we do things. So we want to keep that lens in mind, instead of just an idea of a checklist of things or tasks to do. And hopefully that will prove true as we go here. So a catalyst, speaking scientifically in the chemistry world, initiates or increases the rate of a reaction. You're powerful. You can do that as an instructor. And there are different ways to do this. One, by creating conditions for learning that are optimal and that are mental health friendly. One is by anticipating and alleviating barriers in the curriculum and designing it as such to alleviate those barriers. Another way we can be a catalyst is to really build skills. That's our business, right? We teach people knowledge, we teach people skills, and you can build capacity to cope explicitly by supporting students' social and emotional skills. And we want to be a catalyst by modeling care for yourself. And I know all the emotions that can pop up when someone talks about self-care, because sometimes that prescription for self-care can feel like a to-do list that we don't have the time or the resources for. As a full-time single mom, working mom of four, the little hairs on my neck sometimes stand up when people tell me to prioritize my self-care. But it's important to talk about, and hopefully we'll talk about it in a way that is authentic and that has more to do with outlook than a to-do list. Okay. So if you don't have time for that yoga class, no worries. Our talk about self-care will hopefully be relevant. So I'm going to pause right here because what we've done is we've overviewed some of the mental health concerns that we're seeing. We've chatted a bit about what it looks like, and we're starting to talk about the role we can take. Before we go any deeper, I just want to have a healthy pause here to see if anybody wants to type in or raise your hand to discuss any thoughts or questions so far. We'll give a little bit of time to do that just to make sure we don't miss a thing. Elizabeth, I'd love to hear from you again. And if Brittany's still with us, hopefully she can.
Yeah, okay. So again, a lot of this is very geared towards faculty, which is great and fine. And I think that I have that understanding that that's what it would be. I think modeling the meaningful care for self is so important for all of us because much as you had mentioned in one of the earlier slides, from time to time, everybody experiences something that's perhaps stressful, even if it's positive stress, planning a wedding, having a baby, those are positive means of stress. But so I think some of it is talking through it, like the old talking out loud, about what's going on. And whether you're faculty or, myself, if I'm having a conversation with a student, I think it's fine to, at an appropriate level, share a stressor, which again, could even be a positive one, or if not negative, and express to them kind of just as a matter of conversation, some of the things you personally are trying to do to help alleviate that situation or at least moderate it.
Absolutely. I so appreciate that insight, Elizabeth, because I think really this is the crux of what our role can be. That modeling and the transparency about mental health leads to champion for mental health, right? Whether you're in a faculty meeting or in your classroom or in a personal relationship, if you can name it, you can tame it, right? Like, let's speak out loud about these things. Let's model some of our own ways that we cope, and we'll get into some strategies around that and share some things that one can do. But I'm really appreciating that just reinforcing the importance of this point, because a lot of times, as you see here, it's the last thing on the list, right? And to be honest, it's going to be toward the end of what we discussed today in our hour together. But really, maybe we need to promote it up to the top, because care for self, people are learning and watching everything we do. We know as instructors that we have our explicit curriculum, those things that we list in the syllabi, and we write objectives on the board, and we study for our assessment. And then we have our implicit curriculum, and that's everything else that our learners are soaking in and gaining from our class. And part of what they're gaining is the attribute and the attitude really that we model. So it's true as well for self-care. Thanks, Elizabeth. Crystal's asking about conditions for learning. So now I've listed these 4 things. How can we be a catalyst that promotes mental health? And we're going to go deeper on each of these 4 things. So without further ado, unless there's anything else, I'll pause for a second and we'll move into that. Okay, conditions for learning. So let's just super simplify that and break it down into a few chunks. How do we create a learning environment or conditions for learning that's conducive? Again, for all learners, that these things are going to disproportionately, in a great way, impact those learners that need more support, right? So, our first consideration is safety: physical, intellectual, social, and emotional. So, think about the physical safe space. And we can even go beyond this concept of safety to just think about what's brain friendly in our physical space. Um, Things that are, we know from research that are brain friendly are a simple decor, having it not be too busy and overwhelming in the room. I just want to go into every kindergarten classroom and talk about this because there's so many things in the wall. I don't know how those kiddos can focus, but it's true for adults too, right? Like a aesthetic in the room that's friendly to our brain. We know music is brain friendly if you can incorporate that into what you do. 60 beats per minute is the science behind that, but I think it doesn't have to be so exact. We know that plants have an impact on mental health. This is all proven through really interesting studies. So having things that are alive and wild around us naturally tunes into a different part of our brain that's comfortable with that. So a physical space is important, but we're also talking about intellectual safety. Do we create an environment where people are free to take risks, where it's encouraged to ponder out loud, even if you're not correct? And we all think we create that environment, right? But when we really look closely at like how we frame our questioning or what kind of responses we give, we can always improve. And then social and emotional safety. It really is, as the instructor, our job to create a space where people are safe in that way. So if we're collaborating as a part of learning, have we set the stage for that? Have we set the stage for constructively critical conversations around content that aren't personal? Have we set the stage for dividing up roles in our tasks and our projects in a way that affirms all and doesn't lead to conflict? You know, what can we do to set the stage for how peers are interacting with each other in the learning process? Because we know that learning is inherently social. And we know that as our learners move into their career fields, everything they will do on the job will involve teams of other people. So, how are we setting the stage for that? Are there supportive relationships that stems exactly from that, especially those peer relationships? But do we have supportive relationships with our learners? And I'm not saying you have to know what they did on Friday night or know what their favorite color is, but are you emanating this feeling of care and openness? And I see you as a person. I'm greeting you at the door each day, or I'm acknowledging you, or I'm smiling and warm, or I'm using language that's affirming you. These are ways of being that don't add to our to-do list, but create relationship in the classroom. And are we keeping high expectation for our academic goals? We are here for the business of learning. Are we keeping our sights on those learning objectives, not lowering them, not putting them too so far out of reach of one's proximal zone of development that it's a lesson in frustration? Are we really paying attention to those learning objectives and where they are and meeting our learners where they are? Scaffolding up to those learning objectives, but not never decreasing or dumbing down or diminishing what our learning goals are. So, speaking very vaguely, that's how I'm framing this concept of conditions for learning. There are so many practices that are helpful, and we're going to go deeper into these practices in the next two sessions of this series. But I can just kind of put up a broad list at this time. That sense of belonging we know is super important. Are we getting to know folks? Are we making sure they're getting to know each other? Especially if you're still doing some hybrid learning or some online learning. What are you doing explicitly to help people to connect? Because that's really hard to do when you're online. Are you giving time and space for people to connect with each other as humans? Empowering students, again, that's about language, that's about attitude, that's about giving them roles in the classroom to show their skills. Checking in with students, you can do this in blanket ways. You can use technology or entry slips or just a raise of the hand or a statement like we did this morning. Everybody give me a word of how you feel. You can do it privately. There are lots of ways you can check in and garner data on how folks are doing. Even if it's everybody log in, give me a 1, 2, 3. How are you feeling today? 1 is you're not feeling it. 3 is you're ready to learn. 2 is somewhere in between. You can always be checking in. And then for those who need it more, if you have time and space to check in with them in a more personal way, that's great. Respecting students' identities, respecting the words that they, pronouns and words to speak of them, respecting what they bring as far as background experiences, everything that makes up someone's identity. Communicating and proving trustworthy. Are we following through on what we say we're going to do? Autonomy, choice, voice. We have adult learners in our midst. Are we giving them choices for how to display what they know or to contribute to the class? Is their voice heard? Or are they just kind of robots that have to follow directions the whole time? Are we making space for collaboration that's meaningful? Setting clear goals and expectations, adapting to changing needs. And just one more screen of this. I promise the list won't go on and on. Are we being predictable, previewing change? People need stability, right? Especially if things are feeling out of control in many senses of their lives. How are we instilling this sense of predictability and control in our classrooms? We know that's directly related to folks who have undergone trauma and other mental health concerns. And I will share with you, I'll pause for a story real quick here. When I started out as a beginning teacher, I did all kinds of things not so great, and I learned as I went. But one thing I really think that I needed to learn, well, to put it this way, I once had an evaluation. A student wrote, "Ms. Sherman, your class is like a wild ride. You never know what you can get." And he meant it as a compliment. But for every student that was exciting or worked for, there were lots of kids that I was leaving behind that needed predictability, that needed stability, that needed to know what the next steps were. And I had to learn that and adjust. So we're always learning, right? If there are things that have been traumatic, preparing for those anniversaries, being sensitive to how families are structured, never assuming support systems for people that they may or may not have, being sensitive to what's in the content and whether they could be triggering to people who have been through difficult experiences. Again, we're talking about trauma here. Again, connecting to support systems. If you want to go further to learn techniques to help people to de-escalate, if they're in a sense that's escalated, that's great. If not, you can, refer on to resources in the building or in the system. And just that unconditional positive regard. So I zoomed through these things as if they're all small ideas. They're all huge ideas. We'll go further into this, but these are the types of things, the ways of doing that we're talking about when we talk about creating conditions for learning. Okay, chime in at any time if there's any questions or thoughts. So we're conditions creators, but we're also capacity builders, right? That's what we do. We build skills. By being good instructors in an academic sense, we are being helpful to relieve some of the load of our overloaded learners, right? We are being helpful toward their mental health if we have our act together and we are doing a good job and they are learning what they need to learn. We know adult and young adult learners are motivated and purposeful in their learning. They want to see how it connects to the rest of their lives. And when they see these things start to click, that's going to take a load off a mental burden for sure. We also can help to promote and support social and emotional skills. And I want to be super clear. I'm not talking about teaching values. I'm not talking about some of the curriculum controversies that we're seeing play out in school boards in regard to secondary ed, post-secondary ed. I'm not talking controversy. I'm talking about basic skills of how to regulate our own emotions, connect with others, and make productive decisions. There are things we can do to promote that. And again, they aren't long lists of extra tasks to take on. There are ways that we do things in our classrooms, and we can talk more about that as we go. We can also build capacity in regard to coping skills, specifically when folks are having trouble. I'm talking about breathing techniques, mindfulness techniques, gratitude techniques, little things that we can do to help to center us and bring back into the learning process. We can help model these things and explicitly teach these things. But back to this idea of social and emotional competencies, this is a framework that's really gained momentum in a K-12 sense. And I know our audience today is not K-12, but folks feeding into your departments and your classrooms are coming out of a secondary system where they might be seeing this framework. So again, we're talking about skills such as being aware of oneself, managing oneself and their emotions, being aware of others socially and how that relates to building relationships, and how we make decisions that are constructive and helpful. So these things can be built in and integrated, graded with the academic content. And I know many of you might be thinking, oh, I do this. I do this already. When we have this project, so much of it is about these kind of personal and interpersonal competencies. And I have no doubt many of you do it naturally, but we can be even more explicit, and we can always be learning more strategies in this regard as well. Others of you might be thinking, I really don't have time to teach social and emotional competencies in relation to the content. So hopefully as we go, I'm going to honor your thought on that. I really am. And hopefully as we go, you'll see that some of these things are more integrated and easier than we think. The studies on social emotional learning are really compelling. Again, many of these focus on K-12, but some of them are starting to focus more on the post-secondary system. Because we know that we don't stop working on these skills when we turn 18 or 20 or 30 or 50, that we're always working on these things. And the direct correlation between being more in control socially and emotionally and one's mental health are becoming very compelling in the research as well. This is just one of the seminal studies around social and emotional learning. But if you look at that third bullet, we're looking at outcomes in regard to mental health, trouble with the law, different kinds of disease and health issues, that type of thing. So we want to make sure we pay homage to all these connections. The post-secondary world, colleges, and specifically colleges in Illinois, are also valuing these skills, not only from a self-health and wellness perspective, but from an employability perspective. So you could Google in an essential employability skills framework and see how some of these skills, these competencies, such as critical thinking, active listening, cooperative working, communicating, have been built into an employability skills framework that has been informed by employers. So again, we're coming at this from every angle, including helping to make sure folks have the skills they need to be highly functional in their workplace. All those soft skills that employers are asking for. And I'm going to pause right there. We've talked about conditions for learning. We've talked about capacity building. Before we get into this idea of being thoughtful and intentional about our curriculum, does anyone have any thoughts or questions? Okay. Interrupt me anytime. Otherwise, we'll go into our final 10 minutes or so around this idea of curricular design. So what does designing my curriculum and mental health have to do with each other, right? Well, again, we're talking about alleviating stressors. We're talking about helping all of us to have more clarity in our learning process, to get past barriers. These things are very directly related. So in our curricular design, are we building in some flexibility? Again, not lowering learning standards, but flexible means to get there, flexible ways of engaging our learners, presenting the material, and allowing them to demonstrate what they know and what they can do. Are we anticipating the barriers? We've been focusing on people, right? And what they may or may not be dealing with, the strengths and attributes and challenges that they bring to the table. But let's focus on the environment. Let's focus on barriers to learning. And by this, I mean, are people having to work to get to the work? Are they having so much trouble accessing the software that they can't show what they know on the topic, or they having so much trouble seeing the board that they can't adequately answer the question even though they know their stuff. So we're talking about barriers to the learning process and how we alleviate those. And do we keep, again, those high expectations, always serving our learners through high expectations for what they can do. This focus on the curriculum really requires us to focus on our students through various lenses. And we've talked about some of this before. What strengths do they bring? What is difficult for them? What are their abilities, disabilities, preferences in regard to learning? What are students' identities? What are those cultural experiences, life experiences, family experiences, racial experiences, socioeconomic experiences that they bring to the table? Always looking at I use this image of our favorite machine from the ophthalmologist, right? That we're always looking through various lenses to get a clearer and clearer vision of our learners. Because once we've done that and we're thinking about the content, we can assume a spectrum of learner variability, not just regular learners and learners with special needs. It's not a dichotomy, we know that. It's a spectrum of learner variability, and we can apply that as we're designing the curriculum, again, with this idea that we might just need different strategies for folks to get to the same learning goals. We know that one framework that can help to do that, and one that you can learn more about through ICSPS and other resources, especially CAST, the developer of this framework, is UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And we can pause on this concept with capital letters UDL, which is a trademarked framework created by CAST that gives you a list of considerations in the form of their checkpoints in regard to designing your curriculum. So that's a great resource to check out. We also talk about UDL lowercase as a concept. Basically, those things we spoke about. Is there flexibility in regard to engagement, presentation, and how people demonstrate their knowledge? Are we keeping the high standards? Are we anticipating barriers? Thank you. Brittany has just put UDL resources into the chat for us, so I sure appreciate that. I want to stress here that UDL is not a checklist. Please don't look at it that way and create a sense of overwhelm. It's a resource. So if you're thinking, I really think this is posing a barrier, I really want to learn more about this or do this better, you can look through that framework and see if there's some information there or some strategies that can help. So again, we're talking about keeping the curriculum flexible, not to the point where it creates you tons more work, but just to a point where we're allowing our learners to take some flexible paths in their learning. And here we are, as promised, and this is the problem, right? We talk about self-care and modeling self-care at the end of our presentation when we're zooming through, but I promise you, we're going to spend more time on this later on. So we were just talking about not adding to your to-do list. Let's just acknowledge that the to-do list of an educator is very long, especially when you work in other aspects of our lives. And we are going to, you've heard the oxygen mask analogy, now the coffee cup analogy. You cannot pour from an empty cup. So how do we fill our cup? Again, this is a preview of more to come, but let's just talk through a few of these concepts real quick. Are we prioritizing the sources of joy in our life? Are we nourishing, moving, and sleeping? My goodness, basic needs. We're getting smarter about sleep. We're knowing about nutrition, and we know we have to move our bodies, even if it's just twisting and turning and doing all sorts of funny stretches in our chair. Even if that's all we have, we know we have to move, and we know that that impacts our brain, and we know that our brain chemistry impacts our mental health, and we see the connections. There is a huge body of research developing about how we need to be in the wild. We need the natural world. We need sunshine. We need to be outside. We need fresh air. So we really can't ignore that. We know that impacts our mental health. Some of us enjoy this maybe more than others, but even if you're not a camper by trade or one that likes to hike on the weekends, we know that fresh air and sunshine and being in a natural space is good for our brains. When we look at those to-do lists, being realistic, making choices, well, that's really easy to say and hard to do, right? I've developed a new practice where I don't just list like what I need to do, and I only list 3. I only list 3 at a time. And I get to bring up more if I get through my list, but each day I list really 3 big ideas I need to do. And then there's I should do, I could do, there's these other lists, right? But it has been helpful to me to create a, I want to do this, but I can't list. I want to be the room mother for my 7-year-old, but I can't. And I put that on my list and I let that go. And that's hard, right? But we have to be able to say no to things, even when they're things that we want to do, because we live in a world of surplus and abundance, and we have evolved to create very sophisticated to-do lists in our lives. But that doesn't mean that the time and energy to do it are there. So being realistic, it's hard. Mindfulness, sometimes when people are feeling anxious or having a traumatic trigger or any time of concern, those exercises we hear about, okay, what are 3 things I see right now? What are 2 things I hear right now? What is 1 thing I feel right now? These little strategies, these games we play with our mind for mindfulness really are effective when we look at brain chemistry. Also effective is gratitude. I love this one. We know this intuitively, right? That when we focus on what's going well and we focus on what we're grateful in life, we do better and our brain chemistry benefits, right? But now there's all this research about it. This is one of those things where we know it and then we research it. There's all this research about how incorporating a gratitude ritual, even if it's saying 1 thing in the morning or 2 things at night or making a list every day, being grateful helps that brain chemistry as well. Positive self-talk, our voice in our heads, and the most powerful voice in our world by far. So how are we framing those things positively? And seeking, and here's the hard part, accepting support, whether it be from our loved ones in our lives or seeking professional help. There are many of us on this call, I'm sure, that are dealing with our own mental health concerns. And accepting and seeking help for that is a huge step. So we are getting low on time, but again, the main idea in our roles, we can help to model and capacity build and create conditions for a wellness model, right? That helps people to be at their very best despite the challenges they're bringing to the table. And I hope you'll join us next time as we talk more about this in 2 weeks, and then again 2 weeks after that. You can find those registration links, I'm sure, on the ICSPS website, and Brittany can help us with that as well. And she's put her email in as well for us. So Brittany at ICSPS, what would we do without you? So I'm just going to stop there. And if anybody wants to raise your hand, unmute, say hello. If anybody has anything for us in the chat box, please feel free. That was a very speedy overview. We'll make room for more conversation in the next couple of sessions, I promise. But other than that, that's all I have, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yes, Shanna, so thank you so much. And I was putting in a lot of resources in the chat there. So if there's anything that you have questions on or you weren't able to grab, you can email me and just say, hey, Brittany, this was mentioned. Can you provide me that resource? Or feel free to browse around our website as well and see what other things we have. And if you have questions about it, feel free to reach out to me and I will be happy to answer any questions, as I know Shanna will as well. I put the registration link in for the next session. So feel free to register for that. And if you have any questions about the next 2 sessions coming up, you can contact me or Shanna also. So
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, make use of that email address. Contact me anytime. Thank you all for your time.